scene is Beaufort in the still of the night. The passage is rich in mystery. A man drives along the deserted main street, passing the stately old money homes that face the harbor. He pulls up in front of a rude hut with a dirt front yard. He knocks lightly and pushes the door open. Minerva sits alone in the dimly lit room. Her eyes are hidden by a pair of purple-tinted wire-rimmed glasses. "I want you to put a curse on the district attorney," says the man. "Well, of course," she replies. "Tell me his name again." "Spencer Lawton," comes the reply. Lawton.
It was midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. The spell that Minerva was conjuring was aimed at Chatham County's District Attorney Spencer Lawton, who was then prosecuting Savannah antique dealer Jim Williams for the murder of Danny Hansford. Hansford had been killed in this house on May the 2nd, 1981. Of that, there was no doubt. But there were questions about the circumstances of the death and about an intriguing figure, accused murderer Jim Williams.
Well, he kept people off balance. That he liked to do also. That also created a certain kind of power for him.
Being a homosexual antique dealer in the Deep South is not ever going to be popular.
He was one of the nicest men I have ever known. Just a very nice gentleman. Now, the thing that the others know that they don't like, that's what they know.
So you add all that together, the charm, the brilliance, the wit, the slightly sinister approach to life, and you've got Jim Williams.
John Barrett is the author of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Set in Savannah, where Barrett lived part of the time in the 80s, the nonfiction narrative uses Jim Williams as a springboard into the lives of a cast of characters too unbelievable to be anything but true. The Lady Chablis is perhaps Barrett's most colorful and outrageous character. In the book, she crashes the debutante party, an invitation-only soiree held annually at the Hyatt Regency.
No, that's not fair. That's not fair. He just got the camera zooming.
She also challenges customers and bosses alike from on stage at the Pickup, a gay bar Barrett locates on Congress Street. Oh, and one more thing. Chablis' name before it was Chablis, Frank.
If anyone had said to me one of your friends in Savannah was going to be a black drag queen, I'd have laughed. But in fact, she's a whole lot more than a black drag queen. She is a genius.
Gotta run, gotta go powder that nose, comb that hair, and do all that. See you in a minute.
Barrett's Chablis is bold and unashamed, as likely to tell somebody about themselves as she is to sashay around the room. Chablis is also the stuff of great reading, a natural character whose unorthodox approach to life adds realism to Barrett's prose. She told us the other day that she had agreed to a book deal of her own with Simon & Schuster. The topic is her favorite, Chablis on Chablis. From the bizarre to the sublime, Midnight also zeroes in on Savannah's social scene, the pinnacle of which is at the corner of Gaston and Bull, the Oglethorpe Club. An exclusive setting open only, the book tells us, to the bluest of blue bloods. A mysterious white-haired gentleman reveals the significance of the Oglethorpe Club in Midnight. Over the din of cocktail chatter, he explains that the Oglethorpe Club is an elite social line that ferrets out Savannah's unworthy, saying to non-members that you are not really one of us. Among those not counted among the club's members, preservationist Lee Adler. Lee Adler lives in this house on Monterey Square, and Jim Williams lived in this house. And the only thing separating them, if Midnight is to be believed, is Wayne Street and a river of mutual loathing.
Jim Williams hated Lee Adler, and I can't speak for Lee Adler. I'm sure Lee Adler didn't much care for him.
The feud had its origins when both men were members of the Telfair Museum Board, and in Barrett's words, Jim Williams engineered a plot that forced Adler off the board. The extent of Lee Adler's anger is uncertain, but on page 189, Barrett writes that after Danny Hansford's death, Williams was convinced that Lee Adler had prodded the district attorney into charging him with murder instead of a lesser crime.
He came racing back in the room, crazed, screaming out. His right arm was down by the side, and he said, "I'm leaving tomorrow, but God damn it, you're leaving tonight." And he took a pistol and pointed it dead at me. Now, if you never had that done, you know how it feels right now.
Barrett writes that Jim Williams was charged with murder and the slaying, but insisted that he had acted in self-defense. Williams claimed that Hansford had gone wild, smashing up the house in a rage. He grabbed one of Williams' German Lugers, continues Barrett, aimed it at Williams and fired 3 times. All 3 shots missed. The gun jammed. Williams grabbed his own gun and fired.
I was scared to death. The man had a gun and shot it at me, and I just took the Luger and shot 1, 2, 3. I didn't know it was 1, 2, 3 then, but I just kept shooting. I didn't know how many times I was going to stop him from killing me.
Danny Hansford's body went to Candler Hospital. Jim Williams went to police headquarters. And Savannah will never be the same again.
After Midnight, Return to the Garden of Good and Evil is brought to you by Oglethorpe Mall, your back-to-school headquarters.
Now you can forget about telling your out-of-town friends about General Oglethorpe, General Sherman, Count Casimir Pulaski, and also Johnny Mercer, now that Savannah has a new story to tell with all of the limelight from the international bestseller, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
And this is the boyhood home of Johnny Mercer. This was owned by his grandfather, Hugh Mercer. Hugh Mercer was a banker. He had his fortune in cotton.
Relentless tour buses to Mercer House, plus coverage in People magazine, Newsweek, the New York Times, has put Savannah on the map, literally.
Oh, a lot of times you'll just see tourists drive by and they'll be reading the book and they stop in front of the house and just take a picture of the house just because it's in the book.
This guide to Midnight's sights and scenes was published as a section front in USA Today. And if readers are jealous of Savannah's ambience, well, they have a right to be.
Jekyll and the Nazis offered $1 million for this home at one time, and they wouldn't take it.
They have read the book in New York, and they came to Savannah because they want to meet and see everybody. They want to go everywhere there is to go. It's like I told NBC Today, it's the first murder mystery that makes you want to pick up the phone, call a travel agent, and spend an extended time at the scene of the murder.
When people hear about Savannah, they come here, and then they hear about the book, and they buy the book. And a lot of people just want to have a copy of the book that came from Savannah.
Esther Shaver has reason to revel in Savannah's sudden glory. Her bookstore has sold more copies of Midnight than anybody in the world. Over 5,000 from this little corner on Madison Square. Impressive as that figure is, consider that 300,000 books have been printed, and there are waiting lists for Midnight that stretch from Atlanta to London.
Do you have any advice for an aspiring writer?
Keep writing. Write, and rewrite.
My prediction is that it'll sell eventually 1 million copies. It'll have more impact on Savannah than the Olympics could ever hope to have.
And John Duncan should know, not only is he in the book, but on the day of this interview, he sold 26 copies from his store on Taylor Street.
So everybody's cashing in on the bandwagon. It's going to generate lots of little cottage industries.
But just because it's proved popular doesn't mean that Midnight has won praise from all corners. True, the reviewers seem to love it, but for some of the subjects treated in the book, the experience has been akin to a public airing of Savannah's dirty laundry.
You know, there is poetic license, let's put it that way. So, and sometimes some people are the victims of poetic license at times.
And it's a very affectionate portrait of Savannah, although some people, I readily admit, did get clobbered.
Who shall I write this to?
Midnight's massive popularity is the source of no small amount of anguish among some of the book's subjects, several of whom refuse to talk with us for fear of what they think might make a bad situation even worse.
I just want Jim to be remembered for his contributions to this city.
But Jim Williams' sister, Dorothy Kingery, granted WTOC an exclusive interview in Mercer House in order to paint a different Jim Williams than the one portrayed in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
He was such a unique individual that he could never be captured by the written word. So a page can only do so much for a person like that.
The problem with Midnight, if there is one, is that it's too good. The characters too colorful, and the prose too compelling. Readers, especially non-Savannah readers, get lost in the richness of the story and forget that the figures they're reading about are real flesh and blood.
What was really a tragedy for our family, a very trying and difficult 8-year period, has been juxtaposed with vignettes, social vignettes, as it has.
And what of John Barrett? What sort of uncanny imagination brought Savannah's tired old stories to life in such a creative and intriguing way? Perhaps the explanation for Midnight's success lies partly with the author and partly with us.
Well, our past seems to follow us when we answer a question. You know, if you've ever noticed that, it's like you don't just, a lot of people just aren't cut and dry with something if you're in conversation with them. They have to tell you where all this happened and how it got to where it is now. I don't know why. I think it's just indicative of the South, and we just like to talk.
He has an amazing talent. I mean, you have to add that. You have to add that in. It's a brilliant talent to be able to put that together, and he worked very hard. He didn't just snap it out in a year or two. He's worked on it for years and years.
Ms. Hansford, would you like to say anything?
Jim Williams' first trial brought together some of the South's best legal minds. For the defense, Bobby Lee Cook and John Wright Jones, with Sonny Seiler working with the team while handling the civil suit brought against Williams by Danny Hansford's mother.
He shot him in cold blood while Danny Hansford was seated across the desk from him.
For the state, the DA himself would handle the prosecution in what is clearly Savannah's trial of the century.
Theory of the case was that Mr. Williams was a very impressive, rich, overbearing person who influenced younger people, and that Mr. Hansford was a very young, naive street person who was obviously carried away with the lifestyle that Williams lived. And Mr. Williams took him in and taught him a trade, and it developed into a love affair. They alleged that he wanted to get rid of Hansford and that he lured him into the den and shot him, and then turned around and shot into the desk and contrived the scene to fit the story that he would later tell.
Seiler asserts that the state's case against Williams was good, but circumstantial. That is, they had no direct evidence to refute Williams's plea of self-defense. But one important fact in the case bothered Sonny, and eventually, he believes, swayed the jury. State lab test of Hansford's hands had found no gunpowder residue.
If no gunshot residue is found and that person is alleged to have fired a weapon, it's a pretty good indication that maybe he didn't do it.
And they argued instead
that Jim fired all the weapons.
Barrett paints the trial as a swordsman's duel of thrust and parry. The prosecution plays the homosexual card. The defense counters with a string of eminent character witnesses. But at the end of the drama, the jury sides with the prosecution on the weight, Sonny Seiler believes, of one piece of evidence.
And by far, the most damning piece of evidence that they had, although circumstantial, was the gunshot residue test. And I think this is really what convicted Jim.
Guilty was the verdict, and in Barrett's words, the day that began in the Mercer House ended in the cold confines of the Chatham County Jail. The fascinating stories recounted in Midnight began with the initiation for John Barrett in Bonaventure Cemetery. Mary Hardy was the teller of these tales and more. She sat with Barrett on the bench that doubles as Conrad Aiken's headstone. They sipped martinis while watching the marsh hens, just 2 burial plots away from Georgia's 2nd bishop, the Most Reverend John Beckwith. It was Mary Hardy who summarized Savannah for Barrett in a way that fits the setting. If you go to Atlanta, she said, the first question people ask you is, what's your business? In Macon, they ask, where do you go to church? In Augusta, they ask your grandmother's maiden name. But in Savannah, the first question people ask you is, what would you like to drink? Armed with those impressions of Savannah, Barrett set out to soak up Savannah's charm. But he didn't have to look far. In fact, Savannah's charm came looking for him.
Just a sentimental gentleman from Georgia, Georgia.
Barrett lived on Jones Street, but not in this house. This was Joe Odom's house. Barrett lived in a carriage house just off the lane that runs behind the period pieces along Jones. But he was close enough to Joe Odom to strike up the kind of friendship that would lend yet another colorful figure to Midnight.
Joe's homes never locked the door. Never locked the door. People always knew you could drop it. From the minute I met Joe, there was like an entourage of people always.
Joe Odom and Mandy are portrayed as carefree in Midnight. Joe to the point of being irresponsible.
I do have him forging checks. I do have him moving into houses that he doesn't own and doesn't have any right to live in.
But in spite of a series of harebrained schemes and brushes with the law, nobody who reads Midnight walks away not liking Joe Odom.
There won't be another to treat you like a brother.
Joe Odom was in many ways the embodiment of Savannah as hostess city of the South. Joe's house was open 24 hours a day. He was the most gracious host, the most charming individual in Savannah that I met.
Joe was a lover of life, and he was never, if you were around Joe Odom, you were going to have fun, because that was his main purpose in life. In the book, it appears that Joe's still alive. It was a waste, really.
And I miss Joe. I don't like to think of Joe much now. It's sad.
Pale moon shining on the fields below. Folks are singing.
Emma Kelly is another of John Barrett's endearing characters already familiar to most Savannahans.
It's sleepy time down south.
The author devotes an entire chapter to the lady of 6,000 songs, using the title that Johnny Mercer gave Emma many years ago.
Because I'm just a hard-working mama with a lot of children and play piano, so that's about says it for me.
And she's a beloved figure. And many evenings I went to see her and listen to her play at Emma's and wherever she was appearing. She's typical of what's nice about Savannah and this whole area.
Do you expect to try and squash the subpoenas for your former lawyers?
I don't know. The lawyers would know about that.
What is not nice about Savannah is the jail where Jim Williams found himself until bond was set, pending his appeal. But there would be good news within 2 days for Williams, writes Barrett, when a new trial is ordered by the state Supreme Court.
In attempting to make Danny Hansford more the victim, Jim Williams more the premeditated murderer, Spencer Lawton distorted the evidence in a way that you cannot allow a district attorney to do, even when the district attorney is in the right.
Williams would get another day in court, and then another, and another. 4 trials total before the full moon would signal midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Breakfast at Clary's is a downtown tradition for many of Savannah's colorful characters, and none more colorful than Luther Driggers, who would dine or not dine, depending on his mood, on the same repast every morning.
This would be scrambled eggs and grits, toast.
You know, it depends whether he would eat or not. You know, if he did, he did. If he didn't, they take it away, he'd be on his business.
Luther Driggers is a pseudonym for a very real Savannah character known at midnight for the secret potion in his possession.
And he happens to own a bottle of poison. He sent me a picture of it the other day, a color photograph of this poison that's 500 times more powerful and more deadly than arsenic. And the fear that some people had was that if he dumped it in the water supply, it would kill every man, woman, and child in Savannah. And you have to read the book to see what happens about that.
A poisoned atmosphere concerned Sonny Seiler, too. He feared that here in Savannah, it would be difficult for Jim Williams to get a fair trial, given the publicity the case had generated. But the second trial was held, as the first had been, in the Chatham County Courthouse. Once again, the prosecution was victorious. But once again, the Georgia Supreme Court ordered a retrial and set the stage for the pivotal third trial.
Just a half hour ago, the judge decided to declare a mistrial because the jury was still hopelessly deadlocked at 11-1 after 3 days of deliberations. Now this means there will be a fourth murder trial for Jim Williams.
It was in that astonishing third trial that a crucial piece of evidence surfaced and turned Jim Williams' fortunes around. Remember that the prosecution's case hinged on the absence of gunshot residue on Danny Hansford's hands.
The most damning piece of evidence that they had, although circumstantial, was the gunshot residue test.
Now, suddenly, almost by accident, the entire trial turned around.
Well, I got a call asking in a very innocent way, do you want the admission sheet and all from the pathology department? I said, I wanted everything, but don't I have that? They said, no, we don't think you ever got the records from the pathology department. I said, read it to me. And when they read it to me, I almost fell out of the chair. And clearly it showed that the detectives who testified had misrepresented the facts, that the hands were absolutely not bagged at Williams's house before the body was taken away, and in fact were not bagged until the body was received at the hospital. By that time, almost any expert in the country would agree that the hand wiping test and any results therefrom concerning gunshot residue would be a nullity.
I will never forget the day I was sitting in the courtroom during that third trial, and there was a nurse who worked in an emergency room who testified and blew away the state's entire case. The district attorney was mortified. He was puzzled. It completely stunned him. I interviewed him later and asked him, did you know about this witness? And he literally threw his hands up in the air and said, no.
On the strength of the new evidence, Trial 3 ended in a hung jury and set the stage for the fourth and final trial in Augusta.
Even evidence that might have looked a little strange to them, I think they knew how to read between the lines.
Augusta meant acquittal for Jim Williams. With time to develop the new evidence found during the third trial, Seiler was able to persuade the jury to rule in favor of the defense.
It's that wonderful moment in that Augusta courtroom when my brother was acquitted.
Within the year, the joy of victory would fade. Jim Williams, says John Barrett, died of a heart attack, quote, in the very spot he would have fallen 8 years earlier if Danny Hansford had actually fired the gun and the bullets had found their mark. What would Jim Williams think about the book? We can only guess, but certainly he would read it. He would appreciate the sophisticated writing and the stylish literature. He would probably also take issue with it. Everybody does. But he would read it, as 300,000 others have read it, deep into the night until finally it was after midnight.
While in Savannah, John Barrett was guest of the Magnolia Place Inn on Whitaker Street.